So we'll have time to look at 4 artists here, and they're all great examples of our assignment prompt dealing with image hierarchy and or atmospheric perspective. Getting to know these design terms will help you in general as an artist, designer, or teacher, as well as specifically for this week's assignment. First up, we have Alia Ali, with this really striking image here made up entirely of just 2 different hues. We have a really saturated red and a really saturated blue. These are almost complete opposites of one another on the color wheel, so a really great example of high contrast hues. I love how on the one hand this image is so simple, it's just 2 colors and 3 different scales of the same repeating pattern, but obviously there's so much else going on in it. Since there's no white, it might seem like a challenge to talk about negative space at first, but you could think of negative space being the lightest color in an image's tonal range. So in that case, the red is our negative space, and because of the larger pattern on the head of the figure, there's more negative space there, which is one thing that draws more attention to that part of the image. Here's another example where we can see a lot going on in terms of repetition. We have this smaller brick-like pattern happening all throughout the image, as well as these larger pattern areas. So different parts of the image are getting tied together visually. And even though there's so much similarity here, we really get the impact of the figure standing in front of the regular pattern because of what's going on with the alignment, where out-of-alignment elements stand out over aligned ones. Next, we have Maria Martinez-Cañas, whose work gives us a fantastic example of atmospheric perspective, and that is using variations in hue, value, or saturation to create the illusion of depth in an image. Here, the artist is using saturated, warm hues to bring the left-hand side of the image and the top more into the foreground. Then using desaturated, cooler hues to push these other parts of the image farther into the background. And one of the effects that this has, in addition to creating depth through atmospheric perspective, is attracting more attention to those areas of saturated color. We can see a similar example of that here, using saturation as well as texture. So we have these images inside the circular shape that have a lot more variation in texture than the rest of the image. In addition to being surrounded by a big, warm, saturated rectangle, that texture works to draw our attention to the left side of the image. Next we have Lorna Simpson, and here we can see these really great examples of proximity, where closely placed elements seem related, even though at the same time there's obviously a big contrast in terms of scale. So we're showing something human or anthropomorphic scale against something that's probably the size of a book page. Another example here where we can see how negative space surrounding elements draws the eye toward them more. So we have a central figure here set against the ground, which is made up of completely negative space. And in the figure, we have this balance of saturated contrasted with unsaturated colors. So on the one hand, we've got this very saturated red and the blue and the green set behind the monochrome figure that's on top of those color areas. So some interesting back and forth between saturating and desaturating parts of the image. And last but not least, we have Fred Tomaselli, another really interesting example of using atmospheric perspective. So these really saturated radial patterns here are standing out over the newsprint, which just given its physical nature, can't really support deeper saturation in terms of printed color images. So in addition to layering here and interrupting some of those forms, the artist is using color to push those radial patterns forward in the image plane and call our attention to them as they stand out over the desaturated background. We could also look at his work for some great examples of contrast and alignment, and thinking specifically about these 4 semicircular patterns here that are going into and out of alignment with one another. You can see there are some parts that are continuous from one semicircle to another, and other parts where that continuity breaks abruptly. So again, some really interesting back and forth between alignment and continuity. Okay, that's an overview of the art examples plus some design vocab.